Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Trivett, and I'm an archivist. And this is another episode of An Archivist's Tale, a podcast created by my husband, Jeff Huth, and me. Hi, Jeff.
Good afternoon, Karen.
How are you?
I'm doing well. I've been spending my entire day being an archivist, processing
Nice.
family papers, essentially those that are the publication, hundreds and hundreds of little publications I've created over my life so I can give copies to my children.
Wonderful.
So, so
No,
I'm
you've
doing great.
you've been very industrious today
I know.
and every day. Speaking of
So,
today, it is Sunday, May 3rd, 2020, and it is 4:04 Eastern Daylight Time.
she likes to be very exact
Yeah.
about the time.
Imagine an archivist being exact. Crazy. Well, we're so happy to have all of you joining us today again. And we have a very special guest, and I'm going to ask her to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Tamar Zeffren, and I am also an archivist. Pleased to be in such excellent archival company. I am presently the Archival Collections Manager at the JDC Archives. JDC is short for the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, an entity which at other points in its history has also been known as the Joint. So there has been a willingness to experiment with nicknames and acronyms through I should say through the years, but actually through the century plus 5 years that
Wow.
the organization has been in practice.
Welcome again. It's so
Thank
good to
you.
see you. It's been too long.
Likewise. And I really appreciate the precise timestamp because, as we are all experiencing now, time is just another contested
Yes,
parameter
it's
of
a
our
blur.
days and actions.
Well, we're just going to jump right in with our first question, and that is tell us, what is your archivist origin story?
In thinking back, uh, sort of in sprinkles of memory about it, I realized that probably from high school onward, I had actually always sought out research, specifically research projects, often as a way to avoid group work. And I don't not to extrapolate from that to further trajectories, but I I was always very comfortable, not just, let's say, with going to the library or looking up sources, but in quickly understanding how much I didn't know in terms of those projects. And then when I got frustrated or hit a stopping point, which happened quite frequently, I I enjoyed almost as much the process of figuring out how I got stuck and who to ask about as the actual completion itself.
Mm-hmm. So you're a
And
detective.
yes, I certainly did fancy myself much more of a Sherlockian
Yes.
rather than an archivist, and that will probably come up in other responses down the road. But that was the comfort for me was running into different forks in the road rather than it representing an obstacle,
Mm-hmm.
and that was an escape really from the the drudgery of how those projects or that thinking played out in a school setting. But in a self-directed setting, it was really exhilarating. And in college, I would say were my first sort of intentional interactions with archivists. Though at the time, I just thought that they were lib- librarians who happened to have a smaller room that required a separate staircase. But with
Oh, yeah.
my romantic tendencies, I thought, oh well, it just I'm even more excited to arrive here, having gotten lost several times along the way. It just makes it all the sweeter. And I was involved with a literary debate society at Columbia University called the Philalexian Society. And for one of my history classes, I opted to research Philo's history, which took me to the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia. And I still remember Jocelyn Wilk, who was one of the archivists there at the time. I think she is now the university archivist
Oh,
at
wow.
Columbia, was extremely helpful, even though I have not really occupied the researcher role so clearly since then, has given me an appreciation even now as a practicing archivist for the imprint that a helpful archival professional can leave long after the project itself has been resolved or discarded in favor of another. But I again had no sense of the active work of archiving. Archives were there. They were static. They came alive when I was looking at them, and they were there to serve me. And I didn't have a sense of any intellectual or philosophical currents behind any of that work, behind their existence. After college, I wanted to be a lawyer because I had been told that I should be a lawyer and that I would be a good lawyer. And I embarked on a pre-law course predicated on those two external statements. And I was working, of course, then as a paralegal and studying to take the LSATs. And I actually encountered three separate lawyers turned archivists during that time at various networking events, or especially reaching out to, so I'm a Barnard College alum, and reaching out to alumni through those networking channels at the time. And in many cases, it turned out that one of them later on was embedded at the Winthrop Group, which I had never heard of at the time, but certainly I think has a fairly well-known stamp within the archival world. And I thought, oh, well, that's curious, but we both like filing things, so I guess it stands to reason. And my postgraduate self was content with that explanation. And I sort of just slotted that in as, oh, maybe that's an audience that one day wants to hear about my Philo project. And I moved forward in my other trajectory. And as I had a year-long contract at the time as a paralegal, because I thought it would be useful to have some work experience and a bit of a breather between having fashioned myself an excellent student in an undergraduate capacity, and now assuming I would fashion myself as a student again in a law school capacity. I became almost instantly aware of the gap between practice and theory in terms of deciding to embark on a legal career when I had no innate longings toward, or even really encounters. I didn't have a relative who was a lawyer who necessarily gave me a sense one way or the other of what the lived texture of a professional life like that would be. I happened to come from a family of doctors, and that never stuck. And I went through probably with a contract that was scheduled to end in June. I probably went through a period from like a December to February, a frantic sort of career search period. And now when I tell younger colleagues this, they look at me like I have 7 heads. I went through career fairs up and down. I mean, I think my roommates thought that I was speed dating and that I had so many strains on demand, because I would come home very late and I was always dressed up and I never wanted to talk about it. And then the same pattern would happen 2 or 3 nights, a week, depending on the season, for almost 3 months. And I was just trying to, in a sense, I realize now it serves as a neat, but it certainly wasn't the case at the time, a neat introduction to being an archivist. I was collecting stories. I was trying to gather people's impressions of not just to learn what profession they were in, but what animated them, and when the differences between what they thought it would be and what it actually turned out to be became apparent, how did they grapple with that? And was that distance able to be resolved? And I spoke to probably 70 or 80 people in various capacities over that time. And one of these occasions, wandering through a career fair downtown, I overheard someone talking about the archives program at NYU. Although actually at the time, archives was a faint punctuation mark at the end of a very long name, because I think it was something like the Masters in Public History and Historical Editing with a certificate in archives. My apologies if I'm not quite recalling it with total affinity. And it was just the archives bit that piqued my interest, and I went and indeed spoke with Peter Wosch, who, of course, for this as for many things, remains a wonderful and engaging advocate for archives and, archivists, professionalism. And by the end of that conversation, I thought, I think I might be good at this. I know I would enjoy it. And in a sense, when I came home that evening, my roommate said, "Oh, how was your date?" And I said, "Oh, it was great." And so that was my first intentional encounter with archives came at that stage. I left or I finished out my paralegal role, and I put my other, LSAT and other legal expertise activities on pause, and did not look back, and then started at NYU. And in the middle of my first semester there, a sea change happened. A curriculum modification that had been, I guess, under review by the New York State Board of Regents for a few years now had been approved, and new students were permitted to either continue on with the current length and structure of the program, or to switch into a shorter program, which would be solely a master's in archival management, and the public history focus, which really was, as I had that impression at the time, the marquee draw and really the focus of a lot of the stalwart faculty that had been teaching the program for several decades, was pushed to the side. And so even after, on the heels of having made one, I thought, momentous decision to pursue this, I was confronted as an inexperienced graduate student trying to decide within the first 3 weeks of the semester which of these structures might suit me best.
Wow.
And I opted for the MA in Archival Management, and I'm pleased with it. I don't know whether it was the correct choice because I didn't have enough data in either direction to affirm it, which I guess is also very much part of being a professional. But that was a hard-learned lesson at the time.
That's so interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I was just going to say before I forgot, I also was a paralegal thinking I wanted to go to law school. And I think it really touched on something that struck me favorably about record keeping. It really drove home some principles of record keeping that I had not yet encountered.
You guys are different than I am. My mother wanted me to be a lawyer, and I said, no way. That was the whole argument. Every plan she had for my future, I said, no.
You were efficient. I think my account demonstrates that. I gained some useful connections and certainly some work experience, but really it was the experience of being immersed in something I didn't want to do.
Wow, interesting. Yeah.
Still instructive.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Well, the good news is I'm sure we could have all been lawyers. And I work almost entirely with lawyers now, so I'm sure I could.
So again, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, not at all. And it's so interesting also to hear these commonalities, or at least these points of reference, because I think that even with the scope of opportunities that archivists have to talk to one another and about our profession, is that it's very easy to be siloed even in your own personal trajectory, and to think that I was the only one who thought this and turned this way, and everyone else had a linear narrative, which we obviously that weren't already disproved. One of the, and looking back on my graduate school experience, I think one of the, Peter and some of the other faculty at NYU were wonderful, and they also really, for me, occupy one of the transcendent roles that I believe archivists should aspire to, which is to themselves be nodes of knowledge. I didn't have this a more nuanced grasp at the time of, again, the gap between theory and practice, but very early on into my time there, I didn't repeat my mistake of assuming that archivists were, the invisible hands, the handmaidens of history that automated the process and brought the resources to the researcher. That program really furnished some marvelous examples of archivists, not just as subject specialists, of course, as many of them happened to be in various aspects of history, women's studies, and with later trends certainly within digital humanities, but specialists in learning how to listen to people and to tease out what they were asking for and what would serve their project. And that to me is the most significant remnant of that graduate experience. The advantage, as it were, of graduating a few months right after the global recession,
Wow.
which, saying those words now, has a particular resonance.
Yes.
Essentially almost put me back right into the headspace that I was when I stopped being a paralegal, which was to hustle, because I graduated from NYU in May 2009, and my student loans immediately started coming due, and there were, the prospects were bleak, and I had so many internships in graduate school, and I think that they were all very specialized and compartmentalized. But I was never tasked with having to speak to resource allocators and advocate for and demonstrate the value of the work. I didn't really have to be agile and tailor my principles that I carried out in an airtight fashion from graduate school into a business environment, or a business environment, not necessarily in a corporate archive setting necessarily, but just in an environment which was not an institution of higher education, not necessarily populated by like-minded professionals at that point. I had never been tasked with having to deliver on that front, and so it was really a crucible of not just moving from short-term position to short-term position, but also having my vision, this one monolithic vision of what an archivist did or should do, really the emphasis on the should, be buffeted by position after position, where I would be coming in maybe if I were lucky 2 months before a project would wrap up, sometimes 2 to 3 weeks before a small project or agency here and there were shipping off records to, say, Oregon, and that actually happened. And I came in and there were 100 feet of records, and they said, "Okay, well, this is Tuesday, so can you be out of here by Wednesday?"
Oh.
And I thought, well, surely they mean at least next Wednesday. And then when I started surveying, they said, "Oh, that's just this floor."
Oh.
And I said, "Do I get another Wednesday?" And those are the more colorful outsized anecdotes of it. But it was, I think now, even having been in the profession for a few years, I am surprised in myself that I have clung to this ideal that in a vacuum, absent all you know economic, institutional, market-based forces, that there's one particular way that an archivist should respond in these, and I can still visualize these black and white, so to speak, terms that we encountered in graduate school. And I'm always surprised that I have this instinct, because then I think in the next breath, what's the very next thing I encountered in graduate school was to contest and subvert all of those terms. So those archival polarities have continued to accompany me, I think, throughout most of my roles thus far.
Wow.
Very interesting.
Extremely interesting.
But how did you get out of these sometimes extremely short term jobs, and how much time did it take?
It took about 18 months.
Mm.
So coming to the end of 2009, there were some positions that at least I was a repeat offender. So they might call me back in. I worked for a time for the St. George's Society of New York, which is originally sometime in the 1770s by colonists, colonists here who wanted to establish social welfare projects and resources for, indigent individuals who were at the time based in New York. And through its now almost 250-year history, it had evolved into a North American-based resource for the Commonwealth. So, for example, scholarships for students from Trinidad and Tobago at various times. It would have garden parties and galas the patron was the Duke of Gloucester, to raise funds within North America for, again, the Commonwealth abroad. And I had found my way into them by essentially cold call emailing them. I would go through the art member directory or the Marek member directory. Somehow I was able to do the latter, even though I wasn't a Marek member at the time. So I know before whom I speak, so I apologize in advance since become a dues-paying member and supporter. And I would try to find contact information first of all. I thought, well, I'm an archivist. This can't be beyond me. And I essentially crafted a different missive to every institution, referencing something that I knew or guessed that I knew about their work and their mission, and trying to essentially peddle my services. And I was able to get a meeting with the executive director at the time of St. George's, and did my pitch. And at the conclusion, he said, "Well, we had budgeted a certain amount of money for a new scanner to do this work, but I guess you'll do just as well."
Wow.
Holy.
As good as the scanner.
I mean, I think I remember responding at that point with a rejoinder, something like, "Well, I'll need less maintenance." And then pausing and thinking, maybe that was one of those sentences that sounded excellent in my head and should have remained there. But truth be told, so that was a sporadic, but at least a longer term position where I began to be able to build up some professional credence, and so to be able to say, I've been working in this position, I've evolved it from when I was there for 2 months to 3 months to 4 months, 4.5 months, etc., and continuing to apply to other institutions, apply to roles. I went to every single art event, and I think I had 2 or 3 art mentors trying to broaden my horizons, but also to graft onto myself really different ways of thinking and practicing, because still I'd had one pretty linear model of archival work, which was where processing was foremost, and there are so many other aspects and facets of being an archivist that I was only really beginning to grapple with then. And one of the positions that in that almost 2-year period, 2-year roller coaster, was a posting at JDC for an archival assistant. And I think when I interviewed for the position the first time, I was rejected. Not I think, I know. But a few months later, and I still to this day am not quite sure what occasioned the shift. A few months later, I got a call from HR there, and they asked me if I was still working as an archivist, if that's still something I was pursuing, and it certainly was, and I did, and I came in and interviewed again and started there part-time in 2010, and then became full-time in 2011, which I think in non-archivist years, that's feels like 40. I think that title was probably 4 or 5 titles ago.
Wow.
The tenor of the institutional archives at JDC was such that it had really been active and supported since the 1960s, which for a nonprofit, especially a humanitarian aid organization where the mission of the archives is tertiary at best to the organization's mandate. It's not a cultural institution, not a historical society. Its mission is really rescue and relief all over the world. It's headquartered in New York, but only operates overseas, which obviously plays into, from a record-keeping standpoint, creates a lot of interesting challenges. But that was, there hadn't really been a lot of professionally trained staff. So I think that when I came on board, it may have also been that I was, at that point, still a recent graduate, and that might have spoken to someone within the organization, and maybe I came across as scrappy, scrappy, younger, scrappy, and hungry, and so that's where really a lot of my professional evolution has taken place, in the backdrop of a single institutional archive, which seems pretty. I think it's actually pretty unusual when I think about contemporaries of mine and the variance in the repositories that they've worked.
It can be. I mean, but especially in with people who work in academia. Some of my friends in academia, they don't work any place for more than 2 years. I mean, you're like, how can you live like that? Whereas me, I've essentially had 3 jobs. I mean, literally the jobs changed, but the institution didn't change, and so I've just been places for a long time. One of those jobs only lasted 11 months, so most of it was 24 years one place and what will be close to 10 years someplace else by the time I retire. And so it just depends on the people. But I think there's something good about having an archivist who's around for a long time, especially for an institutional archivist.
Yes, well, I would say that, but I do. I think that it also, a longtime employee, of course, it's easy to say reflexively that there's value added because they have institutional memory, and they have a facility with training, with training and onboarding other staff and being able to be efficient with their use of resources and so forth. But I think, especially for archivists, there's this shadow consciousness of agility, because if the archivist is anticipating and attempting to document what is significant and imperative for the entity, if they're only there for a short period of time, the forecasts they make are only as good as the time they have to get accustomed and to be able to make informed judgments about the landscape. And of course, all of our archival judgments, like all human judgments, inevitably fall short. That's something that I always say, certainly when I'm training new staff or new volunteers. I sometimes lead with it when I present to other constituents, and I sometimes wonder whether the shock value is always the note that's called for. But to me, it's really a clarion call that we have to continually be comfortable with the limitations of knowledge, even as we're striving to do justice to it and to do justice to documenting it. But sorry, as I was saying before, I interrupted myself, which is very much a Tamar motif. The longer an archivist is embedded somewhere, I think the more agile they can be in terms of documenting how the organization's mandate and priorities have changed. And it's a loss not just of institutional memory, but also of agility when you have project staff cycle through something because they're not given the resources or the bandwidth to make the kind of nuanced judgments that knowledge professionals, really can deliver. Those are the ones who can fashion that. Archivists are the ones who can fashion that. And if they're given 2 years to start something but not to sustain it, Jeff, as you're saying, and as your colleagues experience, it impoverishes the profession and the project and the work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I'm thinking about you've used terms like anticipate and landscape, and I think of context and how you have a contextual landscape that you can ever push backwards and even forwards if you're there long enough.
Right, precisely. I like that. Push forward.
Right, and even though I always say archivists are not historians and shouldn't be, even though I say that, it's what the archivist becomes is the memory of the institution from before the time they were there. Mm-hmm. So they will learn the history even if they don't try to, because they will run into so much information and at a greater level of density than anybody else. And so they will know things and they will be able to answer questions more. They will be able to take disparate information and synthesize them faster and more efficiently and more accurately because they have built up that knowledge. And knowledge is everything. And so that's the only reason we're working is for knowledge. And that's why those knowledgeable archivists are the best. I don't think I'm good at a job when I first get there. I might have ideas, I might be able to make changes, but I don't know enough yet. Mm.
Archival absorption. Maybe when we hone ourselves to our finest, we can, as you say, we're able to not just take in knowledge, but to synthesize it. Taking in is one activity, but synthesizing makes it useful and disseminates it for other audiences for the users.
Well, before we jump into your current operations and all that we're curious about with that, I'm curious about that 18 to 24 month period between graduate school and your first official position. And what skills or experiences did you glean and take in during that time that really propelled you?
Um, I think it certainly certainly advocacy, perhaps in a more fervent, concrete level than is often bandied about, let's say in an SAA workshop or as a kind of high level value for an
Mhm.
archivist. I mean, advocacy really on a bone deep level for the necessity of what I could bring to a project for um, following up with in several different channels with several different people about a potential opportunity, and if that opportunity arose, following up with those same people about resources and continuing to see, well, you envisioned this as an anniversary project, but are there other needs that this could support? Trying to embed myself earlier in the decision making process so that I wasn't always just I wasn't always selling a product, or selling skills, but rather could be a co-creator, I
Mm-hmm.
believe. Um, and management in all senses of the word, certainly in terms of my own, um, you know, not just in terms of time management or budget management, and those are crucial, but management of the self, as a professional, um, trying to trying to gauge tone and intensity and urgency. Um, Again, of course, that was always the drumbeat of finding work or identifying a project in the first place. But it took me a very long and hard time, and still does, to delineate my intensity or enthusiasm about a project from everyone else's, to sort of read the room and to understand, is this project truly something that has support, or am I kind of bringing this rush of excitement about it, and it's clouding my judgment about whether this is actually, whether this actually has buy-in, and also whether this is actually what is needed. I think that I rely, exuberance is very psychologically necessary for me, and it's certainly a quality that I cultivate. But through the years, I've tried to tamp it down in terms of collaborative decision making, because
Mm-hmm.
because it's like a firework. It's showy and it's attractive and it can take up a lot of bandwidth, and so you sometimes can mistake that for actual consensus and decision making.
Now you make me think of the phrase message management
Mm.
in terms of advocacy.
Yes, yes, no, that is new to me. I appreciate hearing that, and as well, continually coming to terms with the gap between, I know I've repeated this before, theory and practice. The theory of the type of work that an archivist will be called upon to do, as I learned it in a classroom, as I learned it in a graduate internship, as I learned it when I went to a art meeting or another professional association, sometimes turned out to be very cold comfort when I was thrown into a project. And that's not a it's not a bug in the system. It's a feature of the system. It's not a bug, but it took me a long time, and those, almost 2 years essentially, were a constant kind of refurbishing of my bandwidth to be able to encounter that and go, right, this isn't that I was lied to, or that this situation isn't what I thought it should be. It's that these are all part of the same landscape. The skills that I learned in a vacuum in graduate school are the same skills that I'm applying, that can and should be applied in this situation. But the trick is to kind of have that bridge. And what is the bridge? Am I the bridge? Are my skills the bridge?
Mhm.
That's really the perennial question that I spent a lot of time, and that I was forced to in that time, to survive, to come up with workable ways to channel that questioning attitude.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Yeah, very much. So tell us about your current situation and your operation where you are now in terms of the kinds of materials you work with, the staff that you lead. You mentioned a volunteer uh, cohort. Tell us about all of that, if you will.
In a pre-pandemic setting or current?
Let's go with pre-pandemic, and then we can jump into pandemic.
Pushing the landscape backward.
Yes, ma'am.
So I am fortunate enough to work in an archives team of about 9 people, which is fairly large, I think, for a repository of our size and mission. So very fortunate. I'm, as I said, the Archival Collections Manager, and I have 2 direct reports, and as well between one to 2 volunteers I say semester, because very often it's working with current students, but we have had some longtime volunteers who have been embedded with us for a number of years.
Hmm.
And the one of my direct reports she focuses primarily on processing, which takes place in our off-site facility in Long Island City, where we are in good company with many other repositories that have long looked across the river to Long Island City as a haven for cheaper storage, cheaper sprawling storage, and so as well we have six other colleagues who work with our audiovisual media or oversee our digitization project, and then we report to our director of global archives. Global is appended to the title because we also have an archives branch in Israel.
Oh.
But I would say in New York, we're very lucky that the archives literally sits within the headquarters of the organization. So the offsite facility has a constant flow and traffic of staff, but at the same time, we are fairly visible within the institution itself, which is a boon. And we have our constant customers, such as our legal team or our marketing communications, especially. JDC is a very decentralized organization in that it's headquartered here, but only operates overseas over the course of its history in over 90 countries. And even though there isn't a JDC office in every one of those countries, because sometimes JDC is present in the short term to respond to a natural disaster, and then after a period of time, after working with local partners, its presence recedes. But it has offices in India, in Barcelona, in Ukraine, and a huge outfit in Israel as well, just to name a few examples. And so while currently the transfer of records and interfacing with those offices in that capacity is not something that we've been given a mandate to do, it is always very much on my mind. We're not postponing a question. We're just borrowing time from when that question comes due, as I think of it. So I primarily work a lot with our finding aids presence. I do a lot of QA. I've been striving for the past year or so to build out a task force, a cross-departmental task force to deal with born digital material, because that is, I believe I've succeeded in raising awareness of this issue, and it has sort of stalled there, which I from speaking to other colleagues, I understand is a familiar stage. So essentially, especially as we continue to push forward into a more decentralized work model and into delivering different resources in different sorts of ways to our users, I hope in a sense that will gain more credence, because while everything else is convulsing and the world is turned upside down, the questions about the permanence and integrity of information couldn't be more pertinent than right now. So that's been a hat that I've been wearing for the past few years, and been bringing in where I can experts and suggestions, partially from my own experience getting the DOS certification, and as well all of the attendant professional connections and networks that has exposed me to, and also just from being in New York, where there's such a panoply of repositories who are innovating at all sorts of levels. No longer just one or two university behemoths that that necessarily have the resources to experiment. But I think that there's just and I know I don't need to tell you, such a range of a range of archives who are always trying to do so much with not enough, which is both
Mhm.
an archives and a New York trait.
Talk about agility.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we may be in a hiring freeze. Thank goodness I've only lost 4 people in the last year. Um,
Oh my gosh.
so
Yes, I know. I'm speaking blithely now, but I also, we don't know what the landscape will hold.
we don't.
We
As
don't.
a matter of fact, we don't know how things are going to change. In my work, I finally got people interested in my plan to save $6.5 million. So interestingly, pandemics have some value, which is we have this cost that we keep paying for that I say we don't really need to pay it, and now we might be able to do that. So, but what we're really interested in is how are you, who usually works in an archives, surrounded by your organization or the headquarters of your organization, how do you operate now during this pandemic where I assume you stay in your apartment?
Correct. I certainly speaking for myself, and I think I the office closed formally, I think, on March 12th, um,
Mhm.
or maybe it was the 13th, whatever that Friday was, which I think it might have been the 13th, but that could be some sort of retconning because Friday the 13th just has such an appropriately ominous ring. Um, so first, so there are no staff working, on site, and the offsite facility actually remained open because it serves many customers, not just us, who rent space there. It remained open for a few more weeks, but we had made a determination early on that if our organization is saying to staff to work from home, we're not going to make exceptions, which certainly would include myself and my direct report going to work off-site. You have to have a uniform policy.
Mhm.
And so the stuff, the building blocks of all of this work are are currently, you know, remote, abandoned, and we are sort of a bit lost without them. I think that that's a feeling that wafts through the whole team. Um, one of the elements now of our work that's really risen to the surface is the value of storytelling, um, which which I do want to say in some sense is a thread that runs through our archives work constantly. But there has been, I've noticed, certainly when speaking to my colleagues who deal with reference requests, for example, I'm wondering whether there has been a change in the tenor of the way people are requesting information, in the sense that it's become even more interactive. It seems to be we're all peers. It's not just that we're suggesting resources and they're going off and doing work, and if they have a question, we answer a question, sort of a transactional relationship, but rather that users are digging in even more deeply to materials and asking more contextual questions and asking more provenance questions.
Hmm.
And obviously I would be wary of extrapolating or drawing conclusions about any behaviors now, certainly not in the least because we don't have enough data points to give a coherent explanation. But we've my department is trying to meet this in a sense of by looking at let's say, our social media posts about different treasures from the archives and trying to make sure that it's not a start and stop conversation. This day in this year, this thing was accomplished, and here is the record of it. And we present it to you in a sort of final, all corners of the frame, rounded off way. Rather, that this is a stage in a story. And what we know today, we're bringing to bear on this explanation. But what do you think? This is what we think based on these resources.
Hmm.
So we want to be transparent within the confines of any medium about what enables us to present this as a relatively authoritative explanation behind an artifact or behind a letter written of the eve of a pogrom in 1916, asking, requesting assistance, and the different hands and the different way stations that sort of letter had to pass through. Whereas we might have before been able to rely on different, different attractive shortcuts. If it was presented in an exhibit, it was curated in a certain way. You came to a museum to see it, or you came to request to visit, to visit, to see the material from a distance. In a sense, the user already brought a lot of expectation and kind of associations with archival value to that material. And now that concrete avenue is not possible for who knows how long, it's, I think that we're seeing that users are viewing themselves as being more part of the story. They're not just receiving it, in a sense, as like an audience sitting captively listening to a story, although we hope and strive always to manifest that, but rather in thinking about the ways in which people are looking to content now, not just for context and not just for insight, but also for comfort in the sense that it's an ongoing story and that those contributions and the reactions to something are valuable. And trying to distill that as a mode of practice for a team that is all dispersed. Not all of my colleagues are in the same time zone, for example. Everyone is making different sheltering decisions. That's a constant preoccupation, because there is a lot to be said for recognizing the different degrees of comfort that audiences draw from engaging with archival material, and we don't want to ever substitute our assumptions, which we might have maybe been a little bit more comfortable with before because we felt relatively in control of the landscape. There's that word again. And now we truly are, we truly have to rely on, testimonials. We have the residue now of social media interaction to see whether we are doing this role effectively.
Wow. So what are your resources then? Your memory alone, or do you have some sort of documents that you can get to somehow that you can answer questions with?
We were fortunate that the CIO had already scheduled a pilot work from home day the week before the decree ended up being passed. So the whole organization had a work from home, and this was established in order to be able to identify gaps in technology, in expertise, in support. So we had already begun to set up, to identify our remote needs, whether we, our VPN, the other, I'm just going to call them workarounds because I don't know all of the terms that I'm just sharing my own taxonomy that I came up with in my head for accessing, a box within a box, accessing our database, our shared drives. Some of us, including myself, need not just to access our remote environment, but actually our own desktops. So trying to be strategic about that, because if we run programs that are too heavy and and those machines shut down or they freeze, there's no way that we would be able to, at the present, gain access to that. Wow. So we are relying a lot on accessing those shared drives. And we had come up with a list, actually, as a group beforehand. Everyone itemized their functions, their portfolio, and then we went through and ranked what could be done remotely, what could be done partially, what could not be done at all. And then we had an opportunity to kind of test those assumptions and see, well, could things still be accomplished if they weren't called this? If it's certainly things that were immutable, like this material needs to be processed. It's unprocessed. We have no inventories. This is the first time we're engaging with the material. In the end, it ended up not being possible, let's say, to photograph things, but that we tried at least to create a space for brainstorming and see whether any of the functions that we identified as not being able to be done at all, whether by some refashioning we could make it possible. So that was one of those first examples as a department of agility, of sort of that being forced on us by the pandemic to really rethink, well, what is necessary and what is an obstacle. And sometimes sometimes things weren't obstacles that we assumed they would be. There were certain projects, not the unprocessed material, but there were certain, like, in progress text projects, like scans of transit cards during, in the interwar period, where somebody would be requesting assistance at one port and they arrived at another, and which was really a treasure trove for genealogists. And we printed out all of those. We printed out those lists, not the scans themselves. Those were in a shared drive. We printed out lists of identifying information, and we mailed them out in sections to volunteers and to staff, because we figured, well, if it's, the mails are still operating, and this is something that really you did need kind of a hard copy to check your work, conduct quality assurance against. But then whenever it arrived, this is a project that sort of had a rolling timetable. So we tried to think, well, what are the things that we need immediately, and what are things that can arrive in a month from now? Who can accept, who feels comfortable going to the mail? A bunch of us, because we couldn't mail these packets all at once, they were too heavy. We didn't want one person to be shouldering that burden, that anxiety, so we would take turns sort of putting things in the mail right in the middle of March, and so that by April, we hope that most people would have received these lists, and that was something else that could be tackled in an interstitial way. And it really was, but it's been a refashioning of expectations, not just in terms of responsiveness, in terms of, there have still been technological setbacks, simply because programs are being, and infrastructure are being asked to support activities that they weren't ever envisioned to, and I think also the distance. I think that discover that sometimes people are more reluctant to ask for help, and I'm not just not even saying my department specifically, but we're all interconnected, and we're all working with one another, and you sometimes think, well, so-and-so is probably very busy, so I'm not going to ask them this question right now. I'm not going to call them or email them. Whereas previously you would just walk, you'd glance over and see, are they at their desks? You take the temperature of the room, so to speak, and you think, yeah, I think I can approach them. That like connective tissue of just easygoing interactions that can move a project along and can help you think clearly about what the archival priorities are, is very hard to recapture when we're all at home alone or alone together, but not with one another and not with the stuff and not face to face with our colleagues or our users.
Tamar, if you'll tell us, you've had such an interesting background and certainly interest current day. What keeps you passionate about the archives work you do?
That there's still so much to learn. There's so much that we don't know. I work with records that, let's say from 1914, that have been looked at as one of the crown jewels of our collections, and there have been countless articles and books. I mean, they're really well trodden. We have well trodden records, and sometimes in my own thinking, I sort of glance over them in the sense that I don't know that much about them because, of course, I come in at a certain point. As Jeff said, I come in and you're somewhere in the stream of knowledge of your predecessors, and you're also building on the knowledge that you think you have of the impact of what's already been done with the material. And but it's never a complete picture. Not only is the material itself sometimes the work that's been done about archives or is building on archives actually effaces the archives themselves. And so these opportunities to go back and engage with the material in the first place sheds, not just sheds light on the records themselves, but also on just the constant ways they're being interpreted, reinterpreted, and one will always say misinterpreted, but it's not always a miss. Sometimes it's a re. And also the ever moving horizon of information and how it gets wielded in the public sphere, how we are wielding it, let's say now, to feel more anxious, less anxious, more confident, projections and forecasting. We are steeped, we're swimming in knowledge. We were swimming in it before this state of affairs. And I think that the rhetoric about it is so widespread and so sparky. Like there are so many more voices from different backgrounds, not just professionally, but just geographically, different concepts of time and record keeping, and of value, of assigning value, and whether something having value, how significant is that? That's really a question, especially in the born digital era, and arguing for the maintenance and the sustainability of information. A question that I had sealed myself to be able to address lots of resource allocator questions about the value of born digital records. One that I had not necessarily thought to prepare myself for or thought to anticipate was, well, just because something's valuable doesn't mean you save it.
Mm.
That that is a statement that has credence in certain contexts, but it's and that falls, I feel, within the archivist's purview to try to address. I have a professional responsibility to give that question as much thought as how to navigate a donor relationship, or how I'm going to say that we're going to de-accession something. Is what value is a value? What value is enough? And how do archivists ensure that we're not parroting answers that aren't resonating? Which is not to say that you shift your values based on, or you shift your arguments based on every conversation, or even if you think they won't get a hearing, but rather to not be afraid to reassess. Which seems, I think it seems shocking to me every time I hear myself say it, because what are archivists doing all the time if not reassessing? But at the same time, what value is a value is, the contours of that question. I would never have anticipated when I first became an archivist that that's something that would be coming across my radar. But I see it, I think, in all of the professional discussions, and in our just acute, concerns and forecasts about the future of the profession and the future of information, right? Well, if these values are shared, or if they're not shared, then are they useful? Should they be useful?
That's a good point. Recently at FIT, where I work, we've had a de-accessioning policy and procedure, adopted and approved to put into use, and
Wow.
it's just been like amazing to have that whole other set of evaluation confront me. And I welcome it. Because you don't have unlimited shelf space. And depending on, for me, the curricula offered at FIT, that's going to dictate what is on my shelf or should be on my shelf. And that's constantly changing. So it brings into focus this reevaluation over and over and over again, almost on a daily basis.
Wow, on a daily basis. I guess that would do it.
Yeah.
When did that policy get approved?
I'm sorry?
When did the policy get approved? Sorry, I'm
Oh, no, that's fine. Well, it's, the absolute date escapes me, but I can tell you that it took about 4 years from start to finish, from the inception of the idea to the actual approval of the policy. And then it took some time to develop workflows. How do you take what is conceptual and turn it into, practical terms? So it took a long time, many years. But I would say we've had it in place now for probably 3 or 4 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Incredible.
As I say, it takes a long time to turn a bureaucracy in another direction.
Yes.
And having always worked in bureaucracies, I would understand that.
Yes, you would.
Sometimes I don't have enough time to get it done.
Exactly.
Well, Tamar, thank you very much. It was great having you.
So much fun.
One of our most well-spoken guests ever. Amazing. What a lawyer you could have been.
In my 5-paragraph essay tendencies, I'm sorry.
Too bad. I'm just talking about phrasing. Too bad. Too bad you didn't you go into law because good thing about law is they don't pay as much as archives. So you would have had too little money to survive. But anyhow.
Well, but you put those advocacy skills and talent to work, I'm sure, every day.
Absolutely, we all do.
I see it.
Oh, yeah.
That is for sure. Anyhow, ladies and gentlemen, as you may have guessed by now, this brings us to the end of another episode of An Archivist Tale. But don't worry, don't fret. We'll probably have another one next week. Who knows? We're in a pandemic. Until next time, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.